Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, along with my co-host, Dr. Nikki Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
Today, we're joined by Jacques Chester. Jacques, thanks for being here.
G'day, it's nice to be here.
Yeah, definitely. We're really excited to chat with you, and we have a great topic to dive into that I think a lot of folks are interested in. But that said, can you tell us a bit about your background, what you're up to now and kind of where you are now?
Sure. I am a developer at Shopify. I work in the Ruby dependency security team, and my day job is making life hard for people who try to make supply chain attacks on us, and of course, everyone else in the industry who's in the same boat.
Yeah, what brought you to my attention is I came across this really, really comprehensive article you wrote on CVSS. And I was digging into that with several coffees, and I was really fascinated by the article, the depth of it, and, how much information it entailed. And as I mentioned, I shared it, and it got several thousands of people checking it out on LinkedIn. Many people shared it. So, before we dive in too deep on it, what exactly is CVSS and why should we be talking about it?
So the Common Vulnerability Scoring System is developed by the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, or FIRST. And essentially, it's meant to be a way that you take some information that you know about the vulnerability and you turn that into a ranking. How severe is the vulnerability? So you input factors like, can it be done over a network, or does it need to be done in person or in the same network or remotely? You put in things like how complex is the attack to perform? Does it need user permissions? And so on, and out pops a score between 0.0 and 10.0. Well, actually 1.6 and 10.0, as I point out in the article, in practice, is what you can choose. And the idea is that the higher the score, the worse it is.
Yeah, exactly. I know many of us are on the practitioner side, and we've used this, within tooling that we use for vulnerability scanning, prioritize remediations or mitigations and reporting for leadership and those kind of things. That said, your article kind of opens my eye, along with some articles by others, such as Walter Haydock and some others, of, notable critiques of CVSS as well. Like, you can't necessarily take those scores at face value. There's more nuance and information that you should be looking at as well. What are some of the most notable critiques of the CVSS?
Well, I mentioned a couple in the article. So one that really stood out for me was Towards Improving CVSS by a group of authors at the Software Engineering Institute, who also is the same home at Carnegie Mellon as CERT-CC. So, very, very storied security and software engineering institutions indeed. And they wrote this, in academic terms, absolutely scathing article about CVSS. They really, politely tore pieces off it. And that was one that sort of had been lurking in the back of my mind. And I read that years and years ago when I think shortly after it first came out, I thought, oh, that's really interesting. That kind of makes sense. But then I didn't really think about it much since then and went back to just doing things like everybody else. That one I think is probably, if I got people to read one thing, it would be that, because it really does a great job. There's another one that came out recently, only in the last few months, CVSS, Ubiquitous and Broken, and I feel bad because I've forgotten the author. And the title pretty much tells you what the author thinks of CVSS. And the most interesting part is that there's some very simple sort of statistical analyses where they check for correlations between factor inputs and the propensity or the probability of exploitation in the wild based on a vendor data set. And there isn't a strong correlation at all, which makes CVSS a bit suspect as a scoring system.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm very excited to have this conversation today because about 5 years ago, when I started getting really interested in vulnerability management and trying to understand how the scores actually correlated to how do we determine prioritization, for fixing things. And if we solely focus on criticals and highs, are we actually missing some exploitable vulnerabilities that may end up scoring as low and medium, which can happen. There are a number of vulnerabilities that get scored as low, a 2.5 to a 3.2, and still can be exploitable. They may be a little bit more difficult to exploit, but when used in combination, they can create a critical attack. And so, so that was one of the reasons why I loved your article and getting a chance to read it, because I think the CVSS, the idea behind it is sort of this base scoring methodology that you could sort of start to use and hopefully help identify some issues. But do you have any advice for organizations that, I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but how many vulnerabilities are actually scored as critical and high, and trying to get a hold on how many vulnerabilities are actually scored that high? Do you have any advice or tips for organizations that are trying to get a hold on just the amount of vulnerabilities that are scored that high?
Yeah, I would have two tips. One is monitor the development of another scoring system called Exploit Probability Scoring System, or EPSS. Some of the people who have a background in developing CVSS are involved with developing EPSS. And the big difference is that it's based on building a statistical model of the likelihood that an exploitation will occur based on many factors, not just the ones in CVSS. Just every piece of data they can lay their hands on is an input. I don't think it's fully baked yet. I think the big thing that's sort of pending for EPSS is the productionization of the production of the model, because the model has to be retrained periodically with new data to be up to date. The other thing I would say is, when you see a 7.8 or an 8.8 or a 9.8, those are massively overrepresented in the actual reports made to NVD. So look at those closely, because there will be differences between them when you look at the details. So when you see a 9.8, don't necessarily panic. If you see 10 9.8s, take some time to inspect them to work out which one goes first. They're not equal, even though the scoring system seems to put them that way.
Yeah, one question I wanted to ask you, like from the practitioner side, is like, I've worked in some pretty large enterprise organizations, and we have many, many vulnerabilities to deal with. And there's obviously some nuance of trying to sort through, like you said, kind of going and analyzing and digging into this a bit more. And you mentioned some sources like EPSS. What are some tips for practitioners trying to like get to the bottom of the truly exploitability of a vulnerability, and how to prioritize them accordingly, but also dealing with just, so many vulnerabilities in a massive environment with a large amount of, hardware and software assets, for example?
Yeah, I would say also, like, look to the CVSS score provided by your vendor. They are slightly biased in their own favor, but they do have localized information about the configuration of their software out of the box, and whether they've applied patches to an upstream project, how far behind they are from the thing, from the edge. There's all these sorts of like additional pieces of information that influence what the score will look like. Red Hat pretty much go out of their way to say, don't listen to anyone except for Red Hat. Which is reasonable in their position. I understand why they say that, but also like they make the argument like we have different configurations out of the box from what the upstream does and so on. So that would be the first thing. And the second thing is, you've got to have obviously some idea of the value of the system in play. One of the critiques that comes up, I can't remember if it's from towards improving CVSS or if it's from CVSS ubiquitous and broken, is that it's difficult to apply a universal score to everything in the enterprise. An enterprise that has thousands of units of compute sprinkled around the place, they've got different levels of criticality. The stuff that stores the credit card data is not as important as the one that stores the kitten photos from last year's birthday party, and so you shouldn't necessarily apply the same urgency to each.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question to you, is like, do you think organizations that take that approach of just using simply the base score, not accounting for criticality of system or data, types and categorizations on the systems, is that really an effective approach? But and if not, why does it seem to be ubiquitous in the way that we do it? Because I've never really seen people take it beyond that at large scale, looking into like environmental factors, temporal factors, things like that.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that CVSS does have sort of multiple parts that you can score in, and they get combined. I only covered the base score, which is essentially meant to be about things that don't change, things that are essential and timeless, as it were. And there's a temporal score which talks more about how the environment is changing, and that affects the severity. I think the reason it's so ubiquitous is, first of all, it exists. When you sort of look at Greek mythology, there is the formless void, and things start to spring out of it, and the universe latches onto those, and that becomes the system of order, even though at the end of it you wind up with Zeus and he's a maniac. And it's similar with CVSS. We had the formless void where we had no way to prioritize anything, and we all just went on gut feel. And CVSS provides something that looks systematic and structured, and therefore very attractive. And I think that's the reason it became so ubiquitous so quickly, is that it was really the first of its kind. I think the other thing, of course, is that nobody got fired for, patching in order of CVSS, right? You can justify it by saying, well, we follow this structured procedure, and whether or not the structured procedure sort of holds up under scrutiny is a different question. You can basically say, well, everyone else did it. It's been observed many times by many intellectuals that it is better to be conventionally wrong than unconventionally right a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think that statement is very interesting, because a lot of my research has been around what is classically scored as low and medium vulnerabilities. And some of the pushback I get is, well, we have so many criticals and highs to focus on. We can't also think about the lows and mediums, because we're just underwater trying to get ahead of this. Even if there is a case for remediating some of those lows and mediums, there's a lot of, maybe you have 10 days to fix critical, 30 days to fix highs, whatever it might be, and they're beholden to focusing on those first. So with that being said, do you feel like there's a sort of shift in what we need in the industry as far as vulnerability scoring goes? I think it's probably most people would agree that vulnerability management is tough. It's a tough thing to get a handle on, especially as technology changes so quickly. So do you think that there's sort of a shift that needs to happen between focusing on vulnerability scoring and maybe focusing on criticality of assets?
Yeah, I mean, one thing it's worth mentioning about CVSS, the authors go out of their way to point out that CVSS should not be considered risk. So it's not the sort of the exposure that you have to downside. It's just meant to be saying this one is more severe than that one, right? So I think when you think in terms of risk, you're thinking in terms of there's a couple of different sort of formulae that people throw around. One is vulnerability by threat by impact, which I don't really like. I prefer the more classical one, which is the frequency or the probability that it happens times the magnitude or the amount or the impact or the consequence, however you like to frame it. And when you start to think about risk in that way, it tends to become easier to sort of like work out what you should be focusing on, because you're not just focusing on the severity of the vulnerability or the label of severity. You're thinking more about what is it that could go wrong when this vulnerability is exploited, and how likely is it to be exploited. I'm not the first person to have thought of this. I'm sure that some of your listeners are screaming at their speakers, saying fair, fair, fair. So the factor analysis of information risk by Jack Jones and Jack Freund. I hope I haven't butchered his last name. Yes, that's one of the things I find very interesting and inspiring. The same with Hubbard and How to Measure Anything. But generally speaking, I think you need to be aware of consequences as well as, hypothetical severities.
Yeah, I think it's a great perspective, because it's as someone who's been in, lots of different environments and looking at what vulnerability management sort of means to those different environments. I think it has to be sort of this, there has to be sort of a shift depending on what industry you're in, depending on what threats are most prevalent, which is why I think threat modeling is so important to vulnerability management activities, because it can help inform where you should really focus those remediation activities. Mm-hmm. So as far as vulnerability scoring, vulnerability management, we talked a little bit about EPSS and some of the other scoring methods that are out there. I think there's also the SSVC. I'm going to get it wrong. SSVC. Thank you.
Yeah.
And there are there's a lot of academic researchers out there that are trying to solve the problem too mathematically and focusing on, what does statistical analysis actually look like to help with vulnerability management. So do you think that vulnerability scoring in general sort of needs another set of eyes on it? And I'm thinking about vulnerabilities that come from not just software and hardware vulnerabilities, but when I think about insider risk or APT groups or things like that, like helping to inject some of those types of models in there. Do you think that there's a that may be where the industry is moving, or do you think we're not quite there yet?
Strictly speaking, a vulnerability is not the same as a threat, which is, not the same as a consequence. And, these things have to be thought about separately. One of the sort of the sins of CVSS is that when you add the temporal score, it kind of starts to mix in threat with vulnerability. Maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. People can go out in the street and have knife fights in the halls of academic conferences and that sort of thing to sort it out. I seem to have lost connection. Are you still getting me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Well, maybe good. So I'm sorry, I've lost my thread. I got distracted by what looked like a internet drop.
Oh yeah, no problem. I was just sort of asking about the complexity around vulnerability management and what it means sort of outside of just software and hardware vulnerabilities that, are there other impacts that we should be considering when we're thinking about vulnerability scoring?
Yes. And I've been trying to think about what is a vulnerability, which, sounds very beard strokey. I'll be on the mountaintop thinking deep thoughts, I'm sure, but,
I'll be up there with you. It's okay.
Sure. Right. Well, like now I got to find your PhD. Because it's sort of a question, like some things are vulnerability and some things are not, but we sort of lump them together as just the bads. They have a negative emotional valence, and so they sort of get lumped together. And the question is whether that's a bad thing. So, for example, the question of insider threat, it's not so much a vulnerability. But then how can I justify that statement? What is the definition that lets me say that insider threat is not a vulnerability or a weakness or something else? What's the difference between threat and weakness and vulnerability? So my sort of plan is to write about that at some point in the next, 2 or 3 decades. There is actually quite a lot of existing literature that I need to go through, right? A lot of people have wrestled with this question. A lot of people have discussed vulnerabilities and therefore given definitions of them, and I want to try and get the hang of it.
Yeah, before I'll turn it back over to Chris for questions, but I just had one comment on this because this is really where I feel like understanding etymology, the study of terminology, how did we come up with these terms and what do they mean in different areas and different domains within cybersecurity? Because I think that's where some of the muddling happens, is that what is a vulnerability? I think it's a great question because what does it mean in different contexts? What does it mean to different areas of, what does it mean to incident response versus an insider threat program? So I think it's an important question to ask.
Yeah, one other question I wanted to ask you as well is I know, pivoting a little bit from CVSS and vulnerability scoring, I know you're involved with groups like OpenSSF. Can you tell us a bit about your work there and kind of what drew you there and what you're up to?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, the OpenSSF is the Open Source Security Foundation. As the name suggests, we're very interested in things that make open source more secure on a number of axes and sort of areas of interest. The ones that I mostly focus on, there's 3 sort of working groups that I participate in actively. The first one is securing critical projects, and my interest there is in identifying which projects are critical. So I have a talk that I gave at Open Source Summit North America that you can find on YouTube. How do we rank project risk? In which I'm sort of saying like, well, we have millions of software projects in the open source universe. Which ones are the so-called lib Nebraskas? Which are the ones that are unobserved but turn out to be critical? And how do we find them? And my argument is that we need expert judgment to assist data-driven methods. The second group I'm involved with is securing software repos. So that's a sort of a place, a forum to get together folks from RubyGems, PyPI, Maven, Cargo, NPM. We've had folks turn up from other ecosystems as well. We've started to see people from distribution showing up. I'm really proud of that. I helped to co-found that group. And it's been really interesting, like you talk about a problem and you get the perspective from 5 different language ecosystems, the different things that they've faced and problems they've overcome. And the third group, which is really quite new, I don't know if there's even been a blog post yet, is the end users group. When I first started thinking seriously about security, I was working for a vendor. And so I had a vendor perspective of the universe. But now, of course, I'm a poacher turned gamekeeper. And it turns out when you're thinking from an end user perspective, you sort of see things differently. And some of us here in the OpenSSF want to make sure that, like, while the vendors tend to have the pools of expertise to do things, they have a group swap notes and understand things together.
Another question I want to ask real quick as a follow-up to that, before my final question actually, is you mentioned like the top projects. I know we have the OpenSSF.
Lost the stream here, I'm afraid.
Oh, we can hear you and see you. You cut out for a second. Can you still hear me and see me?
Okay, you've come good.
Okay.
One of those days, the internet, am I right?
Yeah, no worries. So I wanted to ask, like you mentioned, like the top projects, right? And so I know there's the OpenSSF scorecard initiative. Is what you mentioned tied to that, kind of ranking those top projects?
Indirectly. So the one that's sort of most closely related spiritually is called criticality score, which ingests a whole bunch of metrics and puts them into a weighted index and spits out a score between 0 and 1, where 1 is, this is the most critical and 0 is the least critical. Not a ranking per se, just like a level. And the criticality score has difficulties. One, it relies on data that is observable, that can be counted easily or gathered easily in an automated fashion. And the example I give in the talk is, and this comes from David A. Wheeler, it's not an example I thought of first, that you have a single have 1 million downloads, maybe it's important. If you have a single download, well, maybe that download was for a medical devices company. And sure, it had 1 download, but now it's in pacemakers. Right? So which one is important? Without an expert to say this goes into pacemakers, you didn't know in an automated fashion. So the idea of that talk and that sort of approach is that we need to have as broad and a diverse pool of experts contributing opinions as possible. That will be very difficult, is the short comment, but I think important.
Yeah, I love what you said there, because just going based on the metric of downloads alone isn't really going to show you like these are the most critical projects. It depends on the use and the nuances associated there. So that's kind of been an overarching theme of the conversation. My last question for you is, we're obviously seeing an uptick in software supply chain attacks here.
Groups like lost the connection again. We're having a bad day today.
I can hear you and see you. Can you hear me and see me?
Works flawlessly until it doesn't. Okay, I think we're back.
Okay. So last question for you is, we're seeing an uptick in software supply chain attacks, like looking at groups like CNCF or inclu have like, catalogs of open source or software supply chain attacks, I should say. And those attacks have increased in recent years. When you look at the direction we're headed,
again, I'm afraid.
We're losing you.
This is very frustrating.
No worries.
I'm sorry to everybody on the end. I'm going to say it's my connection.
You want to try and kill your video and see if that helps or no?
Let's give that a whirl. People are probably sick of my face anyway.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So last question is like, looking at the uptick in software supply chain attacks and then where we're headed as an industry with things like SBOM and VEX and, the OpenSSF scorecard and some of these other initiatives. Do you think we're, moving in the right direction to try to tackle some of these threats with the software supply chain?
Yes, is the short answer. The long answer involves a lot of hand waving and sort of drawing a diagram on a whiteboard with SBOM and VEX and arrows pointing to SigStore and so on and so forth. But the short answer is yes. I think the OpenSSF has turned out to be a fantastic vehicle for bringing these conversations together. So I'm excited about where supply chain security is headed.
Yeah, I think we've covered so many important topics, but I feel like they blend a lot, like some of the same issues that we see across like open source software, vulnerability management. So with that, since we've covered a couple of different topics, I'm going to take us to our last question, which is, what does cyber resiliency mean to you?
Yeah, so for those who don't know how these work, I get a hint of what's coming so that, if they're going to ask me about my bank account details, I can say I don't want to answer that question. And this question I've been dreading because it's hard to answer. I think often in terms of robustness, like the ability of a system to remain functional under a variety of inputs and conditions. Resilience feels a lot like robustness. Maybe there's more springiness to it. It's hard to say, but I would say that, to me, cyber resilience these days essentially means that you live in a world of threats. And the trick is you need to be able to respond to those dynamically. We used to live in a world where security was achieved in what I think of in a sort of a possibilistic way. You had a binary yes or no, the thing is done or the thing is not done. The firewall ports are closed or they're open. We're allowing this process to run, we're not allowing this process to run. And what interests me is that the industry is moving towards a probabilistic approach where we say it's not enough to say that we ticked all the boxes. We also have to have a model of how the box ticking affects the outcomes. And to me, resilience in the long term is going to be about accepting the uncertainty and mushiness and fluffiness and fuzziness of the world and wrangling it in its own terms.
I think that's a perfect answer. Resiliency is adaptive. So I wanted to say a huge thank you, Jacques, for being here today, for talking to us all things vulnerability scoring, open source software. Thank you again for joining us this week. That's going to wrap us up, and we will see everybody next week. Have a great weekend.
All right. See you then. Bye.